everybody to Signi Coffee Chats. I'm Shane Treadway, your host. And today we're going to be jumping into the theme of racism across the globe. And we have some very special guests with us today. We have had Sharon Hurley Hall on before. She was our last host, so she's going to be helping us out today to get a good perspective on how racism kind of manifests its ugly self around the world and the different experiences that she has had. We also have Philip McKenzie, who's also been a guest on our Signi Coffee Chats. He has his podcast, The Deep Dive, that you're going to want to check out as well. We have a friend of mine, Juan Marcos. He is the director and CEO of Anemo CQ in France. He is also working in Europe to help disseminate CQ in that area and to help companies and organizations grow and apply CQ to their initiatives, which is cultural intelligence. And last but not least, we have Shomi Bhattacharya. She is a new friend of mine introduced by Juan, and she's going to help us understand kind of the neuropsychological aspect of racism, among other things. All right. And so I'm looking forward to jumping into the chat today. Just a little bit about Signi. Signi stands for human significance. And it also stands for the cultural signature that all organizations put on society. Whether we're conscious of it or not, we all have an influence on groupthink. We all have an influence on the narratives that society promotes. We all have an influence on equity. All of us choose to some degree what we're going to promote and what we're going to reproduce in our lives. And what Signi wants to do is help all of us come together, really focus on understanding that significance, understanding that cultural element of who we are as people, understand ourselves as cultural people, our organizations as cultural entities, and really stop and think of the influence that we have and gain the tools in order to be culturally intelligent. So we focus on cultural intelligence as our base. And this is the ability to succeed across cultures in any cross-cultural situation. It starts really with being motivated, looking at our motivation, looking at the type of knowledge that we gain about other cultures, which could be generational cultures, it could be gender, political divides, of course, ethnic divides, racial divides. These are all cultural categories that we need special tools to navigate through. There's also the preparation that we have before we go into a culture, reflecting during an interaction and afterwards. And then, of course, the action that we portray, our behaviors in another culture. And it really is up to the cultural group that we're engaging. They determine whether or not we nailed the CQ action point, right? So that's a little bit about Signi. Our coffee chats are really aimed at giving us a space to jump into themes related to cultural intelligence that are relevant for today, so that we can grow that area of our life and feel more confident as we engage and interact in these different spaces. One of the most complex spaces in US discourse right now and global is the idea of race and racism. And many societies right now are looking at how to frame that, how to understand that. How is this experienced? What's the cause of it? How can we undo it? These are really big questions. We're not going to have answers per se to that, but we will have some very deep, insightful, and intellectual perspective. And so you're going to walk away from this coffee chat challenged for sure, because I know the people who are our guests today. For the first half hour until about 10:35, we're going to be focusing on our guest speakers, our panel, asking them some semi-structured questions, chatting through a little bit. And then at 10:35, we open it up to you, our broader guests, okay? You can always be typing comments into the chat box for interaction, all right? And in the last 25 minutes, we will, based on those chats, ask some of you if you wanna join. I can unmute you and we can you can join the chat is what I'm getting at. So this is open to all of you at 10:35. Before that time, please keep your microphones muted and take some notes, all right? We're also gonna record this so you'll have access to it afterwards, be able to share it with your friends. And I am quite sure we are going to be going very deep. All right, so first of all, gonna start off with a question for everyone on the panel. And we can just maybe go in order of, I think, how I introduced you, which is Sharon and Phil and Juan in Shomi. How have you experienced racism differently across the globe or in different contexts? And maybe you can tell a personal story about that. Sharon, how about you? I know you've been engaged in the Caribbean and the United States and Europe. How have your international experiences with racism been?
That's a really good question, Shane, because racism can appear differently in different contexts. Obviously, I lived in France for a year, for example, and in France, people would follow me in the street and point because I stood out. That was in the 80s. I'd like to think it wouldn't happen as much now, but that's what it was like then. In the UK, it was a little more subtle, though no less present, in terms of detecting subtle attitudes. And there are a couple of ways that this played out. One was liberal white people who were very interested in my welfare up until the time when they thought they could no longer help me. So therefore, I was no longer in an inferior position. And it also came up in applications for jobs. And one story that I think I've told a few times is that a colleague and I went for the same job. We compared CVs beforehand, so we knew what our relative experience was. And she said, well, I'll go for it anyway, but you're probably going to get it because you've got way more experience. But when I got into the interview room, I saw that double take that many Black and brown people are familiar with when your name does not match what the person that they expect to show up. And so I knew almost from then that I wasn't going to get the job, and indeed I didn't. And then in the Caribbean and in Barbados where I live, that shows up as colorism, which is discrimination against people on the basis of the shade of their skin. And I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about it, but suffice it to say that when I was young, there were people that would comment adversely on whether I was pretty or not based on the shade of my skin. And there's a lot of talk about hair, hair texture and so on related to that. I don't want to take up too much more time, so I'll leave it at that for now.
So is my turn? Okay, because you were talking, Shay, but it looked like it was muted, so I wanted to know if you had a segue. But if not, I'm happy.
Muted, and I segued to you, Phil. I asked.
Okay, perfect. It's good to see everybody, and I'm really happy to share this space with sort of my fellow panelists, while understanding that we're kind of in a group together in a kind of a moment of solidarity. So it's good to see all these faces kind of reflected back at me. I think very briefly that yes, in the big picture context, that race is both specific and also very general. And so it can look like different things in different places, but they are some elements of connectivity that unite it, no matter where it might be manifesting in the world. Some of those are specific to people and culture. Some of them are specific to economic conditions, the way in which we exploit under kind of the prevailing global systems. Specific story I think there's a lot of them, some very specific, some are general. I live in New York, in Brooklyn specifically, but I am the child of immigrants. My mom is from Barbados, my dad is from Guyana, and our family story is a colonial story. It's a story of independence from the British in 1966, and then a splintering of that family as people went to the United States, as my parents chose to go to, but other relatives went to the UK, where a big portion of my family is, and Canada, and so the story of many families that toiled under colonialism is a story of diaspora, is a story of splintering. So there's that one particular reference, and then I'll say New York City, growing up in the time in which I did, the 70s and 80s, was a time of deep segregation. As much as New York City is considered to be a probably one of the more liberal spaces inside the United States, especially now, we like to think of ourselves as an island unto ourselves, both geographically and psychologically, or maybe culturally. New York City also has the most segregated school system anywhere else in the United States. Its neighborhoods are deeply segregated. So my upbringing is a part and parcel of all of those experiences, both micro and macro. So I'll leave it there and turn it to, I believe Juan is next.
Yeah, Juan. Juan, you're in France, and you've been in France for some time now, and you're originally from Argentina. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Shane, again for inviting me to these coffee chats, which I really appreciate. But as you just mentioned, because I'm originally from Argentina, my mother tongue is Spanish. But because I've been living in France for half of my life almost now, of my adult life, French is my second language. And please indulge me for my lack of fluency in English, because it's my third language. So I try to be as precise as possible. Please indulge if there is any mistake here or there. So indeed, I've been living in cross-cultural situations pretty much my whole life, because I did the French school in Argentina before coming to Paris. So I've been always around people coming from different world, different backgrounds. I had friends coming from all over the world when I was a child. And when you ask that question about personal experience, I actually started thinking about it a couple of days ago, but it just came up to me as a really shocking, because I remember that the first time I realized that there was something called racism, it's not because someone explained it to me in a sociology course. It was because I actually lived it as a child. And strangely enough, it was because I was discriminated by my brother. So maybe you all perceive me as a white person, which I am to some extent, but I am a mestizo. So technically that means that there is indigenous American blood in my veins. And I said American blood because most of you are from North America, and someone should remind you that every now and then. That's not the whole continent. I'm just messing with you a little bit. But in South America, there were also indigenous people. And my grandmother was actually one of these Native American persons. But when she married my grandfather from my father's side, they had my child and my father, who then had me as a child, and my father was a blue-eyed, white skin, blonde hair person who married my mother, who is also really white, and they had my brother, who was also really white, and then they had me, which I'm a little bit brown, let's say, or a little bit red skinned, like Native Americans. And my brother used to tell me when we were children that I wasn't actually his brother. He wasn't my older brother, right? I was actually found in a garbage can. And I'm pretty sure that he didn't really thought of it as a mean way of discriminating me. I think that he was only taking on these representations that are around him, right? And he noticed that most of my cousins are white. My parents were really white, and I was a little bit brown, let's say. So he just figured out that maybe a way to disturb me was to mention the fact that I was different from him and different from everyone else in our core family. So every now and then I think about that, and I don't resent him anymore, of course, because we're friends and brothers, but ironically enough, he just had a child, a newborn child, and of course, because nature is always fantastic, he looks like me, and he's also. I think he got the indigenous DNA part. So ironically enough, now he has his newborn who looks like me, and I'm always messing with him. But what I'm trying to say, and then I'll pass it to me, is that I sometimes think that this racism debate, it sounds like me sometimes like a game. And I'm not saying that in a naive way. I'm just saying that from a sociological perspective or a social psychology perspective, it's like a game. We are wearing masks in a way, and we are just trying to divide ourselves, trying to name names. And as a mestizo, as a person who is just a mixture of different ethnics, I sometimes feel like, of course, it sounds kind of romantic in a way, but I feel like we are a family, and sometimes we need to just lower the volume and try to listen to one another and try to find ways to make so that conversation is possible, and then we can just reshape representation so that another brother won't call his younger brother a baby found on a garbage can.
At least not have that social fuel to be able to use those aspects of humanity.
Exactly. Exactly.
It would be something that's very positive. Thank you, Juan, for that, for sharing that. Show me.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Shane, for including me in this chat. I love the fact that I'm here, and I love what Juan you said just now. I love what you said. Lower the volume. If only we could listen to that and incorporate that in our lives. Okay, so I come from India, and I was born in India. I grew up there. I spent like 24 years of my life there, and then I moved to Europe, where I've been for the last 12 years. So I've seen a bit of how it is in India and how it is here. So in India, the fact is, we are probably the world's one of the largest producers and consumers of skin lightening products. So we are a very discriminating society. A lot of colorism exists there. I don't think I'm going to specifically talk about racism, but all sorts of isms, like discrimination based on all sorts of skin color kind of unrelated things. So I think discrimination, I know it would be hard for you to believe, but I am one of the light-skinned people in India. So I am the white person in India, which is great. That's sarcasm. Hope no one judges me. But so discriminations with me in my life started, I think, as soon as I was born, because apparently when I was born, the doctor came and told my mother, congratulations, your baby is pretty fair. That's the word they use for describing light-skinned people in India. So, and my mother used to tell that story with a lot of pride to me. And I'm like, okay, there is a weird problem in the society altogether. But anyways, that's a bit of, color-based discrimination that we have in India. And I moved to Europe. There's one funny story that I would like to say. I had a big crush on this guy who was supremely good looking. And he seemed to be very interested in me. And he asked me out for dinner one day. And I went out, and he ended up telling me that he liked me because he wanted to try. That's the word he used. He wanted to try a brown woman once. So that was pretty exciting as an evening. Apart from that, I think a very micro discrimination that I face very often in Europe is the fact that people come and tell me, you don't look Indian. You don't look Indian. You're not that dark. I'm like, do I have to be a certain skin color to be kind of accepted as, an Indian? And I don't know what racism is. I don't know what color-based discrimination is, but to me, it's very obvious that we are all the time discriminating. So I think I would leave it at that.
Thank you, Shomi. Yeah, thank you so much. It amazes me all of the different aspects and experiences. As you talk about the difference between discrimination and racism and a lot of the isms, I know that a question that I have is, and I'm sure a lot of people have, is what is the difference between prejudice and racism? What makes racism unique amongst other types of prejudice, right? What makes battling specifically racism something important to do, perhaps, as we also wrestle with the other types of discrimination? Those are also big questions that maybe we touch on, maybe we don't in the second question I have. Before I jump into the second question, I did want to share a little bit of my story. I am white. I am Anglo descent through and through. I have never been discriminated against in my life. I grew up in a small white town. I was not aware of culture. I was not aware of race and racism. I just grew up and was blind, like most of us are, to what we call culture, the systems, the codes, the files that people throw things in to make sense of the world. I was just a person. But because I was in a dominant culture, I never had a barrier because of my skin color, because of my name, because of my heritage, to have any access to economy, any access to friendship. If I blew it, it was because I said something dumb within the cultural context, or I didn't have a skill, or the same sort of playing field that everybody has. But my racial identity was never a factor. And it wasn't until I went to Peru, I went there to do mission work with nonprofit organization, faith-based organization, focused really on humanitarian type of work. And I probably fell into a lot of the classic missionary type motivations and even attitudes when I was in Peru. Lots of good motives, but just not realizing the cultural stamp that I was reproducing from one context to the other, much of which embodied the colonial type of ideas, types of superiority, complexes that in me were more unconscious, were absolutely unconscious, but were there. And so when I started seeing, wrestling through the type of discrimination, Juan Marcos, that you talked about, of the indigenous people, and we lived 5 years with an indigenous community, and one time a gentleman walked past my yard and saw my white daughters playing in the field and said, "Oh, that's great that you brought your daughters here. You can mejorar la raza," which is make our race better. And that points to that colorism that we're talking about. I was able to go into government, have interviews with government officials to do projects that people whose heritage went back 10,000 plus years there couldn't do because of my heritage. A lot of it maybe from the economic standpoint, but or my nationality, and people feeling, oh, here's a connection to some opportunity. But nevertheless, I know that concepts of whiteness were also there, which is unjust, unfair, discriminatory, those type of things. So my journey when it comes to race is from that perspective. I'm definitely a learner, and right now at this point and forevermore, a listener, and I'm positioning myself as someone who actually unconsciously would reproduce racist type attitudes because I was socialized with them. And so I surround myself with people to help understand those things. I have felt in job applications sometime, oh no, no one wants a middle-aged white guy anymore. I mean, those thoughts have come to my mind. I know what that feels like, but I thank God that I have enough relationship with other people and knowledge of racism to really push that sort of thing away. So that's a little bit of my story. The next question, and we can just again start with Sharon, but we can also bounce a little bit back and forth here if something catches you within the panel and you want to kind of say something. But the next one is, given your expertise in this area, and your intellectual investment, what social or biological factors really lie at the root of all forms of racism? What's at the root of racism, particularly as this embedded form of discrimination? Sharon, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, that's a really big question in a sense. And I always think of it as going back to the big colonial project in history, this idea that places were going to go out and discover other places and pillage them of all their resources. And in order to mentally justify that to themselves, they had to create this fiction, right? This malign fiction that people who didn't look like them, people that were darker skinned than they were not worthy of consideration. And that played out in many different ways. And then they supported that by codifying it into law. So you have this situation where the 17th century Barbados slave code was created by the colonists and planters there in order to regulate how they interacted with enslaved populations. This then jumped and went across to southern states in America, where they used that as the basis for how they interacted with enslaved populations. And we all know how that ended up playing out throughout history, getting onto the 13th Amendment and getting onto Jim Crow and so on. And then it also went across to Germany, where they used that as a way to deal with the Jewish population that they were trying to get rid of. So there's a way in which they decided that they wanted something and they had to have it, and then they put in the laws to justify it, and then used education to continue to create and cement that divide, and that's the legacy we're still dealing with today.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. I think, and thank you for simplifying it, because there's sort of a simple perspective, I feel. And then there's the complexities as the roots go out. And like you're saying, Sharon, people, they wanted something. That was it. It's greed, and they could get it through developing some power structure that oppressed a people based on some sort of concept of, and they chose and created the race concept. I know when, racism has been around a long time, and we see in other cultures as well, where some cultures would conquer, right? They would conquer another culture, and then in their worldview, it's like, oh, because of the gods, if we conquer you, that means that we have the divine right to oppress you. So that oppression wasn't based on race in that context, but it was still based on the same social construction of a reason to oppress that was embedded in the education, the religious systems, the government systems that perpetuated on and on and on and on. And it took a great deal of fighting, a great deal of readjusting narratives to change those things. Philip, what's your take?
Yeah, I think there's a quote that I'll paraphrase, because I know I'll likely butcher it, but I'm sure we've all heard this in one shape or form or another, that as long as the history books are written by the hunters, the lion will never have their story told, right? And I think the project that we live in is to normalize or explain basically the extraction and exploitation that comes through global capitalism, right? So you create a social and religious and legal and extra legal system that is built to exploit, and it makes it much easier from one perspective to reinforce that story, everywhere. So one of the challenges that I've seen is, and I'm only speaking from an American perspective, but as a student of history, that Americans don't know history, right? They don't know global history. They have no context of global history, and they have very little to almost none contextual history of this country. And it is impossible to have a conversation about race if you don't even understand the basis on which your country was founded. So it's a fundamental failing, a purposeful failing of an educational system that is only interested in propaganda. And the propaganda is that, there was a historian, David Blight, and he made this comment in another lecture I was listening to, and he was talking about somebody else, but I chuckled when he said it, that, America starts perfect and goes from there. And that's the mentality, that, the way in which we frame how this country thinks this notion of the founding fathers, right? This notion of patriotism, and it infects everything we do, right? So you go to a sporting event and you have to have the national anthem, right? That's unheard of in most other countries outside of the Olympics. Here, it's a normal cultural celebration of American patriotism. I've lived overseas and you never see commercials for the Army and the Navy and those kind of things. Here, it's normal. We have an authoritarian culture that puts patriotism, which really means a celebration of proximity to colonialism and erasure of people of color and their contribution. And it starts from the time you enter school and continues all the way through, and you don't learn anything else. So it's why people are so angry and traumatized when they're confronted with this notion of anything other than America being this perfect nation state. And America right now is the predominant cultural force in the world. And that is not to say other countries don't have incredible contributions to make, but it's American music, it's American movies, it's everywhere. And so the racism is transported. Westerns back in the day informed cinema all around the world. And what are they seeing? They're seeing white people in a manifest destiny that is romanticized, murdering Native Americans. Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation and, 80s and 90s movies that criminalize Black people. So when they turn on a Law and Order and it's syndicated all around the world, and for 20 seasons, every show opens with, the gangbanger who's likely Black or Latino, and then you have these heroic public defenders, that tells a pro-cop story. And that's everywhere, right? So I've tried to resist getting off into the weeds, and I apologize. I feel like I've taken too much time, but these cultural narratives reinforce the ideas that erase people. And the Capitol insurrection, to name another American thing, white people in America are shocked by this. And I look at that and I'm like, this is the American story playing itself out just in a modern time. To be shocked at the events at the Capitol is to be completely ignorant of American history. So when people say that and they reflect those things, they're invested in the fantastic notion of America that they do not want to confront, has no basis in fact and reality. And I'll leave it there. I'm sorry I went on too long.
No, you did not go on too long. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Phil. Juan.
Yes, I'm cutting line with Jimena, who also wanted to ask a question, but just to follow the first order, I'm just going to say that, and to spice up a little bit the debate, I know Philip digitally, but I just want to spice up a little bit the debate and tell him and everyone that I agree, I would say, with half of what he's saying. I think that it's the way, plus I'm not in America. I haven't ever been in North America, so I don't know how things are there. But I do know that oppression, it's most of the time about hierarchy, right? And hierarchy, it's about the sense of belonging of tribes and groups. And in the way I see things, and this is why I'm I half agree with Philip, is that, of course, I think that there is oppression and that there are horrible things happening all over the world. But there was also a time in which societies thought that the best possible king was the child of the king. And those societies end up disappearing because they were built on the idea that hierarchy and the system of hierarchies was inherent. And the oppression was inherent. And in the way I see it, I think that it's necessary to start creating a new narrative. And this is what we also discussed with Philip, I think, in last time. I think that it's necessary to create a narrative that it's not just the antagonism of the current narrative. We need to create a narrative that it allows people to identify themselves as something else than just the result of the main narrative, just as the oppressed of the first narrative. And I know that that's hard, because sometimes in order to create this new narrative, you need to unleash some of these, let's say, anxiety and anger and some of these facts that haven't been taken into account. It's like I think the psychological term is acknowledgement. You need acknowledgement in order to move forward. But I do think that you also need the new narrative in order for the acknowledgement to be really taken into account. Otherwise, the acknowledgement may be there, but because there isn't a new narrative, we only stay in this, let's say, not really positive way of approaching the debate. And what I'm trying to say, just to summarize, I fully agree with what Philip said. I think everyone here agrees that the world needs to become a better place. But the problem is that we are not here surrounded with the white supremacists. We are here surrounded with people wanting to create a new narrative. So in my estimation, it's maybe the time, the 21st century should be the time in which we create all together those who are aware of the lack of acknowledgement for the minorities, for the oppressed people. It's our job to create the new narrative and stop, in a way, raising awareness amongst the aware. I know that that's hard. I know that that's not the easiest way to approach. I know that what I'm saying might trigger some sensitivities, and I'm sorry, but I also have the feeling that there is this necessity of creating a new way of identifying with a new narrative that it's going to allow us to move forward in a way. So I'm all for taking disagreements and debate about that. That was also the idea of spice up a little bit the debate. So.
Yeah, Juan, no need for anyone to apologize, and because I think these are the type of this is what's on our minds, this is what's on our hearts, and this is an opportunity to come together and listen. And like you said, that's how we will create culture together, is by sharing our narratives and lean towards understanding the different perspectives people are coming from. So I think that's why we're here. So thank you, Juan. Show me. I know that you had talked about kind of the neurological aspect. That's your focus, right? Tell us a little bit about what you've discovered in this realm. Maybe 2 minutes. Sorry to put a time limit on you.
No worries.
Not fair.
Okay, I'll go super fast. So I think I'm the only biologist in the panel, and I have some kind of a responsibility to defend science in a way. But anyways, I would pick up from the comment that Tatiana made that even babies discriminate. That's a newspaper article you sent. And yes, of course, babies discriminate. We are innately born to be able to discriminate between different facial features, physical appearances, because we have a certain in-group, out-group, discriminatory possibilities. It's, in humans. And that's important because it guarantees living in communities, and which is kind of safer for us when it comes to security. It's better. It makes us have better access to resources, so on and so forth. But biology is not the reason behind racism. Okay, racism is a negative word, and biology is not causing it. I give you an example. No one is born with a capability to differentiate between religion, right? People based on religion. We are not born with that. But see the amount of misery that's being created by discrimination based on religion. So if innate biology would have been capable to create such misery, religion-wise discrimination wouldn't have been possible, but it is possible. So racism is the same. You are born with certain capabilities to differentiate between people. Differentiate is the word, because we are supposed to see if the person who is looking at us with in a kind manner, or is in a weird manner. You're supposed to recognize these facial clues and cues from people in the society in general. But we are not born to hate people who do not look exactly like us, or who are darker or lighter in skin color than us. So biology doesn't cause it. Also, another thing I would like to say is, yes, biology gives you the power to be able to differentiate between the people around amongst the people around you. But it's the same biology which gives you a wonderful capability, that is plasticity of the brain. Our brain is an extremely plastic organ. We can modulate our thought processes and condition our behavior and everything through experiences. So that is where the social angle comes in. So everything that we are today is not only because of the genes that we are born with, but are also because of all the changes or everything that we have experienced since we were born. So I think I should leave it there, right? I'm almost done with the time limit, right? I think I gave a bit. If someone has a question, I'm ready to answer, but I don't want to take too much more time.
Yeah, I'm understanding, show me that you're pointing out, if I'm understanding correctly, what I'm hearing is you're saying humans biologically have a disposition towards discrimination without positive or negative, just a differentiation factor, leaning
Yes.
towards what's familiar, fearing what's unfamiliar.
Yes.
The rest of the aspects are socialized, and because our minds are pliable, there's hope that we can re-socialize away from a lot of these negative things.
Absolutely. I think I would take another 30 seconds to talk about the experiment, a brain imaging based experiment that I was talking to you people the other day. Like they did an experiment in which they took white people and black people, sorry for the words, but let's be real, and they showed them pictures. Sorry?
We use white and black in America to, yeah.
I mean, I think it's ridiculous to be not able to use the color, and I'm brown and that's what I am. Anyway, so they took a group of people and they showed white people pictures of white people and black people, and they showed black people the pictures of white people and black people. And what they saw is that when they showed the pictures to a white person of someone who was of a different skin color, that person got a certain neural activation in a part of their brain that is responsible for, negative emotions, the amygdala, okay, like fear, stress, and all these kind of things. But when they continue to show the person the same picture for a longer period of time, these negative reactions disappeared. That clearly means that familiarity is, the way to go. We have to create a society in which we are mingling with a lot of other kinds of people, different skin colors, different behaviors, different cultures, different everything. That is how we, kind of build a society which is cooperative and, not discriminating. So that's the point. Biology can be a bit of the problem, but biology also has answers. And we are only, always using things like biology or things like journalism. We can use these as tools, and these are powerful tools, and we can use this to massacre an entire population, or we can also use this to build positive things in the society. So
fantastic. Show me, that's great. Yeah, that's powerful. And I was just reading a Harvard Business Review. I think it's back from 2014, a little bit old one, but it's about why D&I, EI initiatives fail. And one of their main takeaways was when it's forced, it usually fails. But when it's voluntary, there's a lot more success. But one of the pieces that I'm hearing resonate from what you're saying is the successful aspects of the DI is when there's engagement, when there's relationship, when people are working side by side, when there's mentoring. That tends to break down stereotypes, where there's friendships and stuff. And Sharon Hurley Hall, I know you've said that before too. You start building friendships, you start building relationships, and there's a lot there. Let's open it up now to the to you all participants. If you have a question you want to engage, you can speak it out. Maybe down in the reactions area, there's this little like raise hand thing. I think I just put mine up there. And of course, the first hand is a white one. That says something. And but feel free to raise a hand or do anything, put a heart up, whatever you want to do. And I'll call you and you can speak in. Anyone have a, okay, Chris, did you unmute yourself, Chris?
Yeah.
All right, go. What's on your mind?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I agree with a lot of the things that Philip said. I've lived outside this country for a long time. I'm American. I'm from California. I think, I think it's now that I've lived outside the States, I find it odd how Americans sort of idolize the idea of what it is to be an American, and I don't think there is any true way of how are you an American. I think it's really abstract in some way, but what's not abstract is I lived in Japan for a long time. I still consider myself somebody who lives in Japan. I got stuck here because of COVID, and that's a long story, but I digress back into the real meat of the conversation. Is culture worth protecting? And I think that's a really good question, because in Japan, everybody is Japanese, and you make friends with people who aren't Japanese, who are from a completely different culture from the country that you come from, simply because you have something in common. Neither of you are Japanese, and you're both in Japan. And, as long as I've lived in Japan, and I still live in Japan, I'm married to a Japanese person, and my kids are half Japanese. And as well as I can speak the language and kind of integrate myself into my neighborhood and stuff like that, I have no chance of ever becoming Japanese. It's not on the cards. Never. I will never be accepted as a Japanese person or as a regular dude. I will always be a gaishin, period. There's nothing I can do about that ever. And everybody knows it. And none of the foreigners that I know who live there care about that. Of course, we're not experiencing the same sorts of adverse racism and things like that other people have experienced living in Japan. But what the Japanese themselves are very, very, very afraid of is losing their cultural identity and losing the culture of their company by allowing lots of immigrants into the country, even though they desperately need immigrants because it's a shrinking society. So what I'm wondering is what do you guys think the culture is worth protecting? It's racist. I mean, the Japanese views, as far as I can tell, those are sort of racist feelings. They don't want, they don't want, the Koreans celebrating Korean culture down the streets of Japan or Philippines, or, Americans, waving the flag around in some American parade. Yeah. They don't want that in Japan, but they want to celebrate their own being Japanese. So
yeah, so I hear you. I hear you, Chris. Thank you. Just the way I understand, if you could just give a quick maybe yes or no, is that you're saying in Japan, ethnic identity and nationality are very tied, and all the culture that goes around that. And
absolutely.
Okay, so someone from a different ethnic group, it's so tied together that it's really hard to find an inroad into that particular nation state apart from ethnicity and heavy cultural norms.
Even their religion, Shinto Buddhism, they do not take converts. If you come to Japan as a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu or whatever you come in, you cannot become a Shinto Buddhist. Okay. They don't allow that. Yeah, you can remain whatever religion you believe in, no problem with them, but you can't be one of theirs.
Gotcha. Yeah, Chris, I know Philip, he had sort of responded to something that you had said. Did you have something in mind about that, or about Chris's comment? Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, I'll try my best. I am not expert at all on the kind of goings and comings of Japanese culture, so I'd be very hard pressed to kind of speak to it in the specific. I do think that there's nuances in all of these conversations around something like a nationality, particularly when that nationality is ethnically based, and sort of a cultural identity, which I think is more of an American construct, that's slightly different, right? Because the American construct, the North American United States of America construct, started as a colonial project, right? There were people that existed here prior to the first people, colonists coming, and then there were people brought here as enslaved people from another place, right? And so that history is completely different, right? And so a lot of, for a long time, legally and extra legally, culturally, you defined your Americanness by what wasn't American, right? Which were enslaved people, which were indigenous. So your Americanness was very much tied to what wasn't. It was always built on a contrast, right? I can't speak to, the thousands of year history of Japan to make a similar case. I don't know. But I think, again, in an American construct, these are really, really important ideas to distinguish, right? And, I think this is hard work. And I completely agree with Juan that we need new narratives, right? We need, what I call viable futures. There isn't one future, there's any number of viable futures, right? But we also have to, and I think this is his piece about the acknowledgement, we have to own that history, right? Because if you're using a false notion to explain why certain things aren't happening, right? And these are all very American constructs, right? Just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? You'll hear that all the time. Like, oh, well, my relatives came here and they had nothing. Why can't Black people do it too? You're just lazy. Isn't it that the case? And I'm like, well, no, right? Because if you don't know that many programs like the New Deal and, the GI Bill were purposefully denied to Black people, the same things that were used to help other groups get ahead, that were systemically denied from other people, then that bootstrap analogy could potentially make sense to you. That's right? So those counter narratives have to be built on telling truths about people, right? Reconstruction so-called freed the slaves, and then you had another 100 years of segregation and Jim Crow, right? So when people say, oh, slaves have been free for 100 plus years, get over it. How am I supposed to get over that? Right? Like, that's just an impossible conceit. But if you don't know that history and you think of slavery as just a bad job, or Irish people were slaves too, all of these lies, right? So the lies prevent you from moving forward, and you have to confront the lies, or you're not even having the same language. I'm speaking English and they're speaking, Swahili or something.
Yeah.
Right. And that becomes impossible to do, which is why I think, as much as it's hard, because you're dealing with trauma, right? People are dealing with these false notions of themselves. And unless you pull down that hierarchy, it's, I think, very, very difficult to move forward in a real way. Right. And I think we're seeing that in the case in the UK with the woman who was just murdered. Right? Like, if a woman cannot walk home safely, I don't want to hear about all men. All men didn't do this. Who cares? Right? It doesn't matter. The environment is unsafe because it's built on misogyny. So it does not help me to sit there and say, well, all men don't do this. Yeah, but that woman is dead, right? At the hands of law enforcement, who act as if it doesn't matter. And then they drag women protesting away in the streets. These things are deeply, deeply wrong. And me pretending that years of patriarchy don't exist, and I'm not suggesting anyone said that, but I'm saying for those who are not in this room that present those arguments, I have to push back against those arguments.
Absolutely. Sharon, you had something to say in response as well?
Yes, related to that, because we were talking about this idea of what is American, and Phil touched on it just now. There's also an idea of what is British. And you see it coming up in certain arguments, like at Christmas, where there was a Sainsbury's ad, I think, showing a Black family celebrating Christmas. And people were all, oh, this is the woke brigade going too much. This is not really British. These people don't look like me. And I'm thinking, one ad in 60, 70 years of doing ads that has an entirely Black family, and everybody's all, and I think also in the UK, similarly, people have not owned the history They haven't said, well, you know, we've gone out and we've pillaged these places and we've gathered all these people from all over the place, and now they've come here, and now all of a sudden we don't want them, or we don't recognize their right to be here. But, you know, had that whole colonial project not happened, these connections might not exist in the same way. So I think there's definitely a, if I could call it, a whitewashing of history, which leaves out the role that the British played in enslavement and colonialism. And so people don't fully understand. I don't know exactly how this is taught in the UK, but I certainly get the impression that nobody really owns and acknowledges the full role of the British in the history of colonialism. It's presented as a very good thing from the British point of view. We came, we saw, we conquered, we got things. The country was much better off. It doesn't tell those. It's not telling the lion's story, right? Yeah. It's only telling the hunter's story. And so I think there's still this idea that exists there of, you know, this is what British is, and British is not, in the minds of certain people, it is not. You know, it is not brown, it is not non-English speaking, it does not represent diverse cultures. And so there's all of that. Again, I think you come back to education and a proper acknowledgement of the history, and an acknowledgement of what that history has led to now in order to start fighting racism.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I know we have 4 minutes left. I had seen Tatiana and Vanita's hand up, and earlier. I don't know which one came up first, and I think Tatiana had to step out. So are you still here, Tatiana?
No.
Vanita, what was on your mind? Oh,
sorry. No, I'm unmuted now. Well, it was just going back to this question of power and race and appearance. It just crossed my mind that there's a story, since talking about, you know, Salmi and her story about India and colorism. Apparently, the ancient Indian, in ancient Indian literature, darkness was a sign of beauty. And this disappeared completely, or well, over the years, in the 14th, 15th centuries, when India was then invaded by the Mongols from the, you know, from sort of Central Asia, and they were much lighter skinned. Yeah. And so I was just wondering that if it's so closely connected with power, do you think that when we are talking about alternative futures, do you think a change in the power paradigm, where, you know, countries which have been traditionally, or races which have traditionally been seen as economically disadvantaged, do you think that once this changes, that it might lead to some kind of change in all these other paradigms, you know, related paradigms? Because it's like, you know, tentacles from this power paradigm, it's sort of sickers down and seeps into all aspects of social life. So it's just a question. I don't know, but yeah, it was
I love what I love about that question. I'm sure others resonate is you're asking, like, what's the core root that if we chop that off, sort of the rest of this whole tree and all these other things might die. Uh-huh. And I think us exploring that would be very beneficial. I'm sure some of us do. And sometimes I think too, like if we focus specifically on racism, I sometimes think that if we break that, all the other little prejudice will fall away, because they're all sort of based on a lot of the same ideas. But I don't know, who would you like to, to jump into that 30 seconds. Is there someone you would like to hear from specifically, Vanita?
I like listening to all of you, so whoever feels they've got an answer to that, I would be delighted. Salmi is off.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Yeah, I seriously believe that the core problem is human greed and power play, like the core of everything. And I think, honestly, it's not a very positive thing, but it's also a positive thing to say that we will always have problems, if not this one, another one. If we won't have white supremacy, we'll have black supremacy someday. We might have brown supremacy someday, okay? All depending on the power play, which person is in more power. That can happen. But the point is, fighting against these, you know, hardcore, horrible tendencies that human beings and animals in general have is always going to be there. We'll always need people like us in the society. Okay, there's not going to be one clear, simple solution to problems like this. So very deep rooted.
Guys, I am obligated right now to wrap up. It's 11 o'clock. What I would like to do before we completely finish up is first thank everybody on our panel. Thank you so much, Shomi. Thank you so much, Sharon, Philip, and Juan. You guys are awesome. Thank you to all of our guests as well. What you've put into the chat is fantastic. I also want to ask right now that all of you, our panelists, please put in ways that our guests can connect with you. Sharon, I know that you are one of my core guides when it comes to understanding racism. I follow all of what you write, support you how I can in your endeavor. Please feel free to put in the chat how our guests can connect with you. The same, show me. I'm not sure if you have a website, something specific. Please throw that in the chat. Juan, maybe the Anemo website, and Philip as well with your deep dive. A podcast is very deep, and you are very forthright in all that you say, which is why I love having you on. You pull no punches, and thank you for that. Again, as far as Signi, if you want to check out what Signi is all about, feel free to go to signi.org, see what we have going on there. We do cultural intelligence workshops. We help organizations in DEI projects as well. We focus on design thinking. If you have something you want to create and want to implement design thinking, my wife, who is actually on down there, she is our design thinking expert, Carrie. So she helps take organizations through processes, design thinking based on cultural intelligence. So thank you, everybody. I am going to stay on for another 5 minutes. So if anyone has to go, feel free to go. We have wrapped up this coffee chat. Those of you who want to stick around and maybe throw out some questions or keep a little bit of discussion going, I do have some time. So take care, everybody. Have a fantastic day until the next chat.